They thought he was just a boy born into chains, quiet, obedient, powerless. But by the end of one night, Solomon would bury 9 of Charleston's cruelest masters alive, and no one would see it coming. The first thing Solomon remembered was the heat. Charleston in the summer was relentless, the air thick and heavy, sticky against his skin, carrying the scent of the harbor mixed with smoke and sweat. He remembered the sunlight streaming through the cracks in the slave quarters, illuminating dust particles that danced lazily in the air, and the way the wooden floorboards creaked beneath his small bare feet. He was a boy when he first understood that the world treated him differently, not because of anything he had done, but because of the color of his skin and the blood that ran through his veins. His mother whispered it to him in the quiet moments before dawn, warning him to keep his head down, to obey without question, to smile when the masters demanded it. But even then, Solomon could feel a strange tension coiling within him, a sense that the world's cruelty was wrong, that it could not go unanswered. Charleston was a city of contrasts, and a child's eyes were especially good at noticing them. On one side there were the grand mansions of the wealthy, gleaming white in the sun, with iron gates, manicured gardens, and fountains that sparkled as if mocking the suffering around them. On the other, there were the alleys and small quarters, where enslaved families huddled together in wooden shacks, their walls cracked, their roofs sagging, the floors perpetually damp from the constant humidity. Solomon had grown accustomed to the whispers of fear that floated through the quarters, the muffled sobs of children whose parents had been whipped the day before, the frantic scurrying of servants as they tried to anticipate every cruel whim of their masters. Yet, in the midst of this horror, he had also begun to notice the small sparks of resilience, a quiet gesture of defiance, a word of comfort passed from one enslaved person to another, the way hands would clasp tightly in the darkness of the night, promising protection and solidarity. Even as a boy, Solomon had eyes that absorbed everything, ears that listened to everything, and a mind that never stopped turning. He watched the way his masters moved, the way they believed themselves untouchable, the way their arrogance left cracks in their armor. He learned which ones were cruel for sport, which ones were careless with their wealth, which ones allowed the whip to speak when their patience ran thin. There was a certain rhythm to their lives, a predictable cycle that a careful observer could exploit, and Solomon was learning. His own family had been torn apart by the whims of the wealthy. He remembered the night his father had been taken away, accused of speaking out of turn, his hands tied, dragged through the streets, and Solomon had stood frozen, helpless, watching the man who had taught him to walk, to run, to hope, vanish into the darkness. His mother's cries had etched themselves into his memory, but what stayed with him more than grief was anger. That anger was a seed, buried deep, growing quietly, nourished by every injustice he saw, by every lash, by every insult, by every act that reminded him of his powerlessness. Solomon's days were filled with endless labor, the kind of work that drained every ounce of strength from a person while leaving the mind sharpened by necessity. He carried water from the wells, hauled wood, scrubbed floors, polished silver, and ran errands for masters who treated him like he was a shadow, a ghost to be ignored until needed. Yet he watched, always watched. He noticed when a master left a door unlocked, when a servant hesitated out of fear, when a weapon was carelessly left unattended. These details were seeds he planted in his mind, building a mental map of the weaknesses, the patterns, the vulnerabilities of those who had oppressed him and his family for generations. At night, when the world grew quiet and the hum of Charleston faded into the distant sound of waves and the occasional barking of a dog, Solomon allowed himself moments of reflection. He would lie awake on the hard floor of the quarters, the boards cold against his skin despite the lingering heat of the day, and imagine a world where he could act, where he could turn the tables, where the masters who wielded power so carelessly would feel the weight of their own cruelty. He pictured their fear, their screams, their desperation. He imagined himself walking freely, no chains on his wrists, no lashes on his back, no need to obey without question, and in these dreams, the anger that had simmered for so long became a guiding force, a fire that would not be extinguished. Solomon also learned the language of subtlety, the ways to hide thoughts and intentions in a world where even a misinterpreted glance could mean punishment or death. He learned to smile at his masters, to lower his eyes when spoken to make himself seem small, insignificant, obedient. But beneath that mask, his mind worked tirelessly, mapping strategies, envisioning possibilities. He understood the power of patience, the importance of waiting for the right moment, and the danger of acting too soon. Every whispered order, every cruel remark, every slap across the face was catalogued and filed away, stored for a time when it could be turned into leverage, when it could serve a greater purpose than survival alone. Despite the harshness of his world, Solomon had moments of humanity and connection that sustained him. There were the quiet lessons from his mother, teaching him about courage in the face of terror, about resilience, about the importance of keeping one's dignity intact, even when the world sought to strip it away. There were the small gestures of kindness among the enslaved, the way a shared meal or a comforting word could create a sense of solidarity that was unbreakable. These moments reminded him that even in the darkest corners of Charleston, life persisted, and hope, however fragile, was never entirely lost. By the time he was a teenager, Solomon had grown stronger, taller, more aware of the injustices around him, and more determined than ever to rise above them. He had learned how to move silently through the quarters, how to blend in, how to overhear conversations without drawing attention. He began to notice patterns in his master's behavior, the way they trusted their power to shield them from danger, the way they underestimated those they oppressed. Every cruel act they committed, every display of arrogance, became a brick in the foundation of a plan that had begun to take shape in the corners of his mind. Solomon's intellect and intuition were sharpened by necessity. While other children his age may have focused on play, he focused on observation, on understanding the world and the people who dominated it. He understood that power was not always in strength, that intelligence could outmaneuver brute force, that patience could achieve what rage alone could not. And in these realizations, a sense of purpose began to crystallize. He was no longer just surviving, he was learning, planning, waiting for the moment when his knowledge, his cunning and his courage could be transformed into action. Even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, Solomon found moments of defiance, small but potent. He would resist in ways that did not draw attention, misplacing tools, delaying tasks just long enough to assert a fragment of control, or simply holding his head high when a master expected submission. Each act, though seemingly minor, reinforced his sense of self, his belief that he was more than the chains that bound him. The fire inside him burned steadily, fueled by the injustices he witnessed, by the suffering of those he loved, and by the knowledge that he would not be broken. It was in these early years, in the heat, the sweat, the fear, and the quiet moments of reflection, that Solomon became something more than a boy trapped by circumstance. He became a witness, a thinker, a strategist. The experiences of his childhood, the beatings, the fear, the loss, the whispered lessons of his mother, and the resilience of those around him, shaped him into a man who would one day confront the darkness with a cunning and courage that his oppressors could never imagine. Each lash, each humiliation, each injustice added fuel to a fire that would burn long and bright, preparing him for the moment when patience and planning would intersect with vengeance. By the time the sun set on another sweltering Charleston day, Solomon had already begun to construct the invisible architecture of his revenge. He walked among his masters as a shadow, silent and unseen, absorbing every detail, every nuance, every weakness. He was learning not just how to survive, but how to turn survival into power, how to convert oppression into opportunity, and how to transform rage into strategy. And though he was still a boy in the eyes of the world, in his heart and mind, he was already becoming the force that would one day rewrite the rules of a city built on cruelty. Even as night fell and the sounds of the city grew softer, the distant calls of night birds, the lapping of the harbor waves against the docks, the occasional creak of a mansion gate, Solomon lay awake, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him, feeling the echoes of every injustice, every lash, every cruel word. And as he closed his eyes, he allowed himself one final thought. One day, the fire inside him would no longer be contained. One day, Charleston would remember his name, not as a boy, not as a slave, but as the reckoning that walked silently among the masters, waiting for the moment when patience, intelligence, and fury would collide. Solomon's anger had been quietly building for years, a slow-burning ember fueled by cruelty and injustice. But it wasn't until that night, the night the masters overstepped, the night their arrogance became too much, that it flared into a flame he could no longer contain. The moon hung high over Charleston, casting a pale silver light across the cobblestones and mansions, illuminating the elegance of the city that was built on the backs of those like him. The air was thick, humid, carrying the mingling scents of the harbor, of smoke, and of the sweat of 1,000 slaves working endlessly in the sweltering heat. In the stillness, Solomon felt the rhythm of the city, the creaking of the doors, the whispers of servants moving quietly through the shadows, the distant bark of dogs on the outskirts of the mansions. It was as though the entire city was holding its breath, waiting unknowingly for the storm that was about to rise from within the shadows. That night, Solomon's master, a man whose cruelty was as habitual as breathing, returned from a night of indulgence, drunk with power and arrogance. The man's laughter echoed through the mansion halls like a threat, loud, unthinking, and cruel. He demanded obedience, and when it was not immediate, he lashed out, striking a servant who had made the mistake of answering a question too slowly. The sound of the whip cutting through the air, the screams that followed, the humiliation etched into the faces of those around him, it all struck Solomon with the force of 1,000 injustices, awakening something inside him that had long slept. It was not a blind rage that consumed him, not a momentary spark of anger that would fade with the sunrise. It was the recognition of injustice in its purest, most violent form, and the realization that the world would never protect those who were silenced. Solomon's chest tightened, his heartbeat accelerating, and in that rhythm he felt a strange clarity. Every cruelty, every slap, every insult that had been inflicted upon him and his family, every tear that had been shed in the quarters, these were not mere memories. They were fuel. They were the beginning of something larger, something deliberate, something that could not be ignored. As the nights passed, Solomon began to see patterns in the chaos. The masters, drunk on their own power, were predictable. They moved through the mansion with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, never expecting someone they considered beneath them to truly understand them, to truly see them. He noted the doors left unlocked, the servants who were too afraid to question orders, the hallways that echoed too loudly under their steps. Every detail was absorbed, catalogued, and stored. Solomon's mind, sharpened by years of observation and suffering, began to weave these fragments into a larger plan. He was no longer just reacting to cruelty, he was beginning to orchestrate it in reverse, planning a reckoning that would be felt deeply by those who had caused so much pain. The spark of vengeance was not a sudden act, it was deliberate, calculated, patient. Solomon knew that any rash action would mean death, not justice. The masters were strong, their guards numerous, and the city itself a maze of dangers, but patience, he realized, was a weapon as powerful as any sword or whip. He moved through his daily routines with care, smiling when expected, lowering his gaze when ordered, while all the while his mind worked tirelessly, envisioning the steps necessary to turn suffering into power, oppression into consequence. The more he observed, the more he realized how blind the masters were to the resentment they had cultivated. They believed that fear alone would keep Solomon and others like him in line, that cruelty was enough to maintain control, but in their arrogance they underestimated the intelligence of those they oppressed, the patience that came from years of suffering, and the fire that could ignite from a single act of cruelty too many. That night, as he lay in his quarters, the moonlight spilling across the floorboards, Solomon allowed himself to imagine what justice could look like. He saw the masters trapped, powerless, facing the consequences of the lives they had destroyed, of the fear they had inflicted, of the chains they had placed upon innocent shoulders. The vision filled him with a mix of fear and exhilaration, a dangerous combination that made every nerve in his body tingle with anticipation. The first steps toward vengeance were subtle, almost imperceptible. Solomon began to test the boundaries, observing how the masters reacted to small acts of defiance, noting which ones were easily flustered, which ones were methodical, which ones relied too heavily on their sense of superiority. He learned how to move silently through the mansion at night, to avoid detection, to blend into the shadows. Each night he grew bolder, more confident in his ability to navigate the world that had sought to crush him. The rhythm of his life became a delicate dance between obedience and preparation, between survival and strategy. Solomon also began to cultivate a network of understanding among the other enslaved people. Though they could not yet act openly, their whispered conversations, their shared glances, their cautious trust provided him with insights, resources, and subtle aid. He learned who could be counted on for loyalty, who might falter under pressure, who had knowledge of the city, the mansions, and the patterns of the masters that could be useful in the future. The web of connection, though fragile and dangerous, gave him a sense of solidarity and a foundation on which to build his plans. Every smile, every nod, every silent agreement was a reminder that he was not alone, that the fire of vengeance could be nurtured collectively, even if the action itself had to wait for the perfect moment. The nights became his teacher. In the darkness, Solomon honed his patience, his understanding of fear, his ability to anticipate reactions. He studied the sounds of the mansion, the floorboards that creaked when a master walked too heavily, the doors that rattled when unlocked, the distant clink of keys and chains. He memorized every corridor, every hidden nook, every shadow where he could conceal himself. The city itself seemed to whisper secrets to him in the quiet hours, revealing the vulnerabilities that the masters believed did not exist. Each observation, each small piece of knowledge became a tool, a brick in the architecture of revenge he was constructing, silently, invisibly. Solomon also wrestled with fear. There were moments when the enormity of his plan, the dangers involved, threatened to paralyze him. He imagined being caught, punished, perhaps even killed before he could act. He felt the weight of responsibility for every life that would be affected by his choices, for the consequences that would ripple outward from his actions. Yet fear, rather than weakening him, sharpened his focus. It made him meticulous, careful, deliberate. Every movement, every decision was filtered through the lens of survival and strategy. He learned to turn dread into discipline, anxiety into foresight, uncertainty into clarity. By the time Solomon reached the point of readiness, the fire inside him had grown into an inferno. It was no longer merely anger, it was purpose, clarity, vision. He had transformed the pain of years of oppression into the power of planning, the raw fury of injustice into the precision of strategy. He was no longer the boy who had feared the lash, who had trembled at the sound of his master's voices, who had accepted suffering as inevitable. He was becoming something else entirely, a force of calculated reckoning, a shadow moving silently among those who believed themselves untouchable, a mind that could turn fear into consequence. And yet Solomon did not rush. The brilliance of his plan lay in its timing, in its subtlety, in the way it would strike when the masters least expected it. He waited, watching, learning, preparing. Every insult, every act of cruelty, every careless mistake by the masters was another piece of the puzzle, another opportunity to refine his approach, another step toward a night when the scales of justice would finally be balanced. His patience was not passive. It was active, consuming, relentless. It was the patient predator, waiting for the right moment to strike, fully aware of the consequences and fully prepared to execute with precision. Solomon's imagination became his ally. He envisioned the moments of confrontation, the reactions of his oppressors, the strategies he would employ to ensure success. He imagined the terror in their eyes, the disbelief at their sudden vulnerability, the shock of realizing that those they had deemed powerless could, in fact, command the ultimate authority. These visions were not fantasies of cruelty for its own sake. They were blueprints, rehearsals, mental exercises designed to prepare him for the reality of action. Each imagined scenario strengthened his resolve, honed his instincts, and clarified his purpose. In those nights, as the moonlight cast long shadows across the quarters and the city lay in quiet, Solomon felt a profound sense of destiny. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone around him, that his actions would not be impulsive or fleeting. They would be deliberate, calculated, transformative. He was not seeking revenge for the sake of bloodshed alone. He sought justice, a reckoning for years of pain, humiliation, and oppression. And in that understanding, he found not only courage, but a sense of inevitability, that the fire within him, once unleashed, would reshape the lives of those who had shaped his in cruelty. Solomon's transformation from boy to strategist, from victim to avenger, was nearly complete. The ember of anger that had first sparked in his childhood had grown into a blaze, tempered by intelligence, patience, and observation. He had become the shadow that moved silently through Charleston's streets, unseen, unassuming, yet always watching, always calculating, always preparing. The city, unaware of the storm gathering in its midst, continued in its routines, oblivious to the reckoning that approached. And Solomon, standing at the edge of adolescence and manhood, understood fully that the moment of vengeance would not be a wild eruption, but a carefully orchestrated symphony of consequence. And so, night after night, Solomon waited. Each day brought new observations, new insights, new fuel for the fire within. He had become an expert in anticipation, a master of patience, and a student of fear. He understood the intricacies of the human mind, the subtleties of arrogance and overconfidence, the ways in which power could blind those who wielded it. And in this understanding, he found the blueprint for action, the path that would lead him from the shadows of oppression into the light of justice, however dark and terrifying that light might be for those who had lived by cruelty. Solomon's plan had been years in the making, nurtured in the shadows of Charleston, sharpened by cruelty, patience, and observation. Every day, every interaction with his masters, every moment of pain and humiliation had been a brushstroke, painting the canvas of the strategy he was now ready to execute. He moved through the quarters with the same obedience as always, lowering his gaze, smiling when required, performing tasks with apparent eagerness. No one suspected the storm gathering beneath his calm exterior. In their arrogance, the masters believed Solomon was nothing more than a quiet, obedient servant, a boy molded by oppression to fit neatly into their world. They were wrong. The first step was reconnaissance. Solomon observed the masters with the precision of a seasoned strategist. He memorized the layout of each mansion, the position of doors, windows, and secret passages, the location of keys, weapons, and locks, the habits of guards, their patrol routes, and moments of carelessness. Each master had routines, predictable patterns, blind spots in their vigilance, and quirks in their behavior. Some slept with a lantern within reach, some relied on servants to secure doors, some believed their dogs would alert them to danger. Solomon catalogued it all in his mind, turning the knowledge of weaknesses into a mental map of opportunity. He knew exactly where, when, and how the masters could be caught off guard. It was not enough to know their weaknesses. Solomon needed to anticipate their reactions. He watched as they interacted with each other, noting alliances, rivalries, and egos. He understood how fear and arrogance drove them, how cruelty was often a mask for insecurity. In quiet moments, he imagined how each man would respond if he were ever faced with sudden danger, trapped with no escape. These exercises were not fantasies, they were rehearsals. In his mind, he ran scenarios, testing the timing, the sequence, the reactions. Every detail mattered. A single miscalculation could mean discovery and death. As Solomon studied, he began to prepare his tools. Digging was done secretly, under the cover of darkness, in the hidden corners of the city and the plantations, where no master would venture. Each hole, each space, was carefully measured and planned. He worked tirelessly, balancing labor with observation, always maintaining the appearance of compliance. His body grew stronger from the physical demands, but it was his mind that was the sharpest weapon. Every movement, every shadow, every whispered sound was a signal, a clue, a piece of the puzzle he was assembling. He had become a master of concealment, able to blend into the night, vanish in plain sight, and observe without detection. Trust, he realized, was a dangerous commodity. Solomon knew that one careless word, one misplaced glance, one act of suspicion could unravel everything. He did not rely on others for action, only for information and subtle support when absolutely necessary. The other enslaved people in the quarters were aware, in whispers, that something was brewing, that Solomon's anger had transformed into purpose. But they did not know the details, and that secrecy was deliberate. It was better for them to be ignorant of the full plan. Curiosity could be dangerous. Solomon carried the weight of the operation alone, and the isolation was both a burden and a weapon. Preparation was mental as much as it was physical. Solomon spent hours visualizing the sequence of events, predicting how each master would move, how they would respond to unexpected obstacles, how their arrogance might blind them to danger. He imagined the terror in their eyes, the shock at realizing that a servant they had considered powerless could orchestrate their downfall. He rehearsed the timing of every step, the signals, the traps, the concealed paths. It was a dance with shadows, a choreography of vengeance that had to be executed flawlessly. Any hesitation, any mistake, could lead to capture or death. As the plan took shape, Solomon also studied the city itself, understanding the geography, the streets, and the places where he could hide or escape if necessary. Charleston was a maze, but a maze he had learned to navigate since childhood. He knew where the alleys twisted, where the gates were unlocked, where the guards were lax. The city was both his prison and his weapon, and he would use every advantage it offered. He watched the tides along the harbor, noting the hours when the docks were empty, the smell of salt water mixing with the sounds of commerce, the distant cries of sailors and merchants. Every environmental factor was a piece of the puzzle, every detail a tool for the ultimate execution of his plan. Solomon also considered the psychology of his targets. Each master had weaknesses, hidden fears, and predictable responses. Some were impulsive, quick to anger when challenged. Others relied on routine, believing that the same pattern day after day would protect them from harm. Some were cruel to the point of arrogance, blind to their vulnerability, while others were cautious, calculating, and wary. Solomon memorized each trait, turning observation into strategy, using human behavior as both map and weapon. His revenge would not be brute force, it would be precision, calculated and deliberate. The nights became long and tense. Solomon worked tirelessly, often for hours on end, balancing labor in the daylight with planning and digging in the shadows. His body ached, but he welcomed the pain. It reminded him that he was alive, capable and determined. Mind. Every drop of sweat, every sore muscle, every bruise from hard labor was a testament to his endurance, a preparation for the work that lay ahead. Sleep came in short bursts, and when it came, it was filled with dreams of the plan, of each master trapped and helpless, of the final moment when the culmination of years of suffering and observation would come to life. Even as he prepared, Solomon understood the stakes. One misstep could expose him, endanger others, and destroy everything he had worked for. He could not afford mistakes, and so he double-checked every detail, every sequence, every trap. His mind was a steel trap, focused on precision and timing. He reviewed the plan constantly, refining it, adjusting for variables, considering contingencies. This was not revenge born of impulsive fury, it was the product of discipline, patience, and intelligence. The psychological toll was immense. Solomon carried not just his anger, but the fear and anticipation of what was to come. Each night, as he lay awake on the wooden floors of the quarters, he felt the weight of what he was about to do. He imagined the terror of the masters, the disbelief in their eyes, the realization that their cruelty had created a force they could not contain. And yet he also imagined the cost, the moral burden of taking lives, even lives that had caused suffering. These thoughts did not deter him, they sharpened his resolve. He understood that vengeance was both necessary and dangerous, a bala. NCE he had to maintain with precision. Every day, Solomon observed his targets more closely. He noted the guards' rotations, the times when the kitchens were empty, the moments when doors were left ajar. He memorized the location of weapons, the placement of keys, the schedules of the servants. He discovered the weaknesses of each mansion, the hidden paths that could serve as escape routes, the blind spots in the guards' vigilance. He was meticulous, methodical, and relentless. The city, the masters, and even the routines of life became tools in his hands, instruments in the orchestration of a carefully calculated symphony of vengeance. Solomon also cultivated patience like a weapon. He understood that the right moment could turn a carefully laid plan into undeniable success. Acting too soon could be fatal. Waiting too long could risk discovery. He became a master of timing, learning to read situations, to anticipate changes, to adapt his strategy in real time. His mind moved faster than any whip, quicker than any command, calculating probabilities and outcomes with a precision born of necessity. In his quarters, Solomon began preparing the physical traps as well. He dug in secret, hidden from the eyes of the city and his masters, creating concealed spaces that would serve as temporary prisons. He reinforced weak spots with soil and debris, ensuring they could withstand the struggle of those who would eventually be trapped. Each hole, each barrier, each hidden path was Des. Aimed to maximize control and minimize risk. His hands were blistered, his back sore, but he welcomed the labor. It was the tangible manifestation of the revenge he had been cultivating in his mind for years. By now, Solomon had become almost invisible, a ghost moving through Charleston with silent purpose. The masters continued their routines, oblivious to the storm gathering beneath their feet. They laughed, drank, and boasted of their power, unaware that every move they made was being catalogued, memorized, and prepared for a reversal they could never anticipate. Solomon's patience was terrifying in its quiet intensity. He did not rush, he did not hesitate, he simply waited, sharpening both his mind and his resolve until the moment arrived when the plan could unfold flawlessly. The final stage of preparation involved psychological conditioning, not just for Solomon, but for the masters. He began creating small disruptions, subtle moments that would unsettle them, test their reactions, and refine his understanding of their behavior. A misplaced item here, a delayed message there, a carefully timed rumor or whispered warning. Each small act was both practice and observation, a way to ensure that when the decisive moment came, he could predict their actions with unerring accuracy. As the nights passed and the city slept, Solomon continued to weave his web of strategy and preparation. His mind was alive with calculation, his body honed by labor, and his spirit fueled by years of suffering and observation. He had transformed anger into purpose, fear into discipline, observation into power. Every moment brought him closer to the execution of a plan that was both daring and precise, a plan that would turn the master's arrogance into their undoing. And so Solomon waited in the shadows, patient, silent, relentless. The city, its masters, and even the enslaved who whispered in fear and anticipation had no idea that the moment of reckoning was drawing near. He had become something more than a boy, more than a slave. He was now a strategist, a planner, a shadow moving silently through the world of the powerful. The dark plan he had nurtured for years was ready to unfold, and when it did, the world would remember that vengeance, born of suffering and intelligence, is a force that cannot be ignored. The night of reckoning arrived silently, as if Charleston itself held its breath. Solomon moved through the shadows with the precision of a predator, his body taut with anticipation, his mind honed by years of planning and patience. The moon hung low, a pale silver guardian in the sky, casting eerie light across the cobblestone streets and the grand mansions that had long symbolized oppression. Every detail of the city, every alley, every gate, every hidden corridor was etched into his memory. He navigated with absolute certainty, unseen and unheard, a ghost among the living. Tonight, the world would tremble under the weight of a vengeance it had never anticipated. The first master was in his mansion, alone in the dimly lit study, his arrogance unbroken by the hours of solitude. He believed his wealth and power were shields against the world, that the chains he imposed on others ensured his invulnerability. But Solomon had learned the secrets of his routine: the side door left unlocked, the unlatched window at the back, the silent servants who would never betray him. Moving silently, Solomon approached, each step measured, each breath controlled, every sound calculated to avoid detection. The weight of his purpose pressed upon him, not as fear, but as clarity. He had waited for this moment, and he would not falter. Inside the study, the master sensed nothing until it was too late. Solomon struck with the precision of a shadow, overpowering the man before he could react. The struggle was brief but intense, every movement fluid, a testament to years of planning and observation. Solomon's mind worked faster than the man could comprehend, turning panic into strategy, fear into compliance. He guided the master to the pre-prepared pit, the soil carefully arranged to contain him. The man's protests were drowned in the silence of the night, his arrogance dissolving into terror as Solomon executed the first phase flawlessly. Every movement was calculated to minimize risk, every detail executed with surgical precision. As the first master struggled against the confines of the earth, Solomon felt a surge of both satisfaction and solemnity. This was not mere cruelty, this was justice, long delayed, born of years of suffering, observation, and meticulous planning. Yet even in the act he maintained control over his emotions. There was no rage here, no hysteria, only the cold, precise fulfillment of a plan that had been years in the making. Every step he had taken, every night spent observing, every calculation of human behavior had led to this moment. The second master was more cautious, wary of the world, relying heavily on routine and the loyalty of his guards. But Solomon had studied him just as thoroughly, noting the gaps in security, the moments when arrogance blinded him, the habits that made him predictable. The approach required patience and subtlety. Solomon used the shadows, the creaking floorboards, the quiet distractions of the city to mask his movements. Every step was deliberate, every breath synchronized with the rhythm of the house. By the time the second master realized something was amiss, Solomon had already closed the distance, his plan unfolding with unstoppable precision. The process repeated itself for each master, each encounter tailored to the personality, the habits, and the weaknesses of the individual. Some resisted, their pride and fear colliding in a desperate struggle. Some were caught unawares, frozen by shock and disbelief. Solomon adapted to every reaction, his mind moving faster than the chaos around him, predicting movements, neutralizing threats, and guiding each man to the earth that awaited them. His body ached from the physical demands, his mind burned with focus, and yet every action was executed with flawless control. The months of preparation, observation, and patience had converged into this moment of unparalleled precision. As the night deepened, the city seemed suspended in a strange stillness, as if the very streets sensed the extraordinary acts unfolding within them. Dogs remained silent, guards remained oblivious, and the wind carried only whispers of leaves rustling against the walls. Charleston, so accustomed to the power of the wealthy masters, had no warning of the shadow that moved among them. Solomon had become more than a man. He was the embodiment of every injustice, a force born of years of suffering and meticulous planning, moving with unstoppable inevitability. The struggle with the fifth master tested Solomon in new ways. Unlike the others, this man was both cruel and cunning, aware of the possibility of danger but overconfident in his own control. The fight required improvisation, every move a delicate balance between strength, timing, and strategy. Solomon's mind raced, calculating outcomes, predicting reactions, adjusting instantaneously. Each second was critical. One misstep could undo months of preparation. But he succeeded, guiding the master into the earth with efficiency and precision, the man's screams swallowed by the weight of inevitability. By the time the sixth master was approached, Solomon had settled in to a rhythm. He moved with the confidence of experience, each act reinforcing the lessons learned from the previous encounters. He anticipated the reactions, countered resistance, and executed his plan with an almost eerie calm. The precision of his movements, the careful orchestration of each step, demonstrated the depth of preparation, the intelligence, and the patience that had fueled this night. Every success built momentum, every action reinforced the inevitability of the plan. The seventh and eighth masters presented new challenges. They were less predictable, more suspicious, their egos and arrogance sharper than the others. Solomon had anticipated this, and his strategy adapted. He created distractions, manipulated the environment, and exploited every human flaw he had meticulously catalogued over the years. These encounters were tense, fraught with danger, every movement a potential disaster. Yet, Solomon's mind was a fortress, his focus unshakable. He turned fear into control, panic into compliance, guiding each master to the fate that awaited them. The ninth and final master was perhaps the most arrogant of all, a man who had never imagined a world in which he was not the absolute authority. He believed in his invulnerability, in his mastery over every life in Charleston, in his untouchable status. But Solomon had studied him more carefully than any other, anticipating his arrogance, predicting his reactions, exploiting his overconfidence. The approach was deliberate. 8. The execution flawless. The master struggled, cursed, and raged, but it was all in vain. Solomon's years of planning, observation, and preparation culminated in this final act, the last step in a sequence that had been building for years. As the ninth master fell into the pit, the weight of the night pressed upon Solomon. The work was done, the meticulous orchestration of revenge was complete. The city remained silent, oblivious to the events that had unfolded under the cover of darkness. The mansions, symbols of power and cruelty, were now monuments to the futility of arrogance when faced with intelligence, patience, and resolve. Solomon stood among the shadows, a figure defined by purpose and precision, his mind still sharp, his body tense, aware that the night was both an ending and a beginning. There was a moment, brief but profound, when Solomon allowed himself to breathe, to feel the gravity of what had been accomplished. This was not joy in bloodshed. This was the fulfillment of justice, long delayed, long denied, finally realized. Every lash, every insult, every act of cruelty that had shaped his life was repaid, not with uncontrolled rage, but with precision, strategy, and inevitability. The city would wake to a silence that carried the weight of consequences too heavy to ignore, a silence that would ripple through Charleston for years to come. The aftermath was almost surreal. Solomon moved through the city as the first light of dawn touched the rooftops. The streets still empty, the mansions quiet. The world appeared unchanged, yet it was irrevocably altered. The arrogance of the masters had been shattered, the illusions of invulnerability dispelled, and the balance of power subtly, irrevocably shifted. Solomon, having executed the culmination of years of suffering, observation, and planning, became more than a man. He became a force of nature, a shadow that the city would long remember, a legend forged in patience, intelligence, and courage, even as he disappeared into the streets, blending with the ordinary. Unobserved by the few who ventured out in the early hours, Solomon knew that his work was both complete and ongoing. The lessons he had learned, the power he had wielded, the precision of his plan, all would remain with him. The night had proven that patience, strategy, and courage could turn the most oppressed into agents of change, that even the most entrenched power could be undone by those who understood it intimately. And as he vanished into the fabric of the city, he carried with him not just the memory of what had been accomplished, but the knowledge that the fire he had ignited would linger long after, a silent warning to those who believed themselves untouchable. Solomon had become the reckoning, a force that had moved quietly, invisibly, with purpose and precision. The city of Charleston would remember this night, though few would know the full story, and fewer still would understand the mind that had orchestra. Teddit. He had turned suffering into strategy, oppression into power, and the embers of anger into a controlled, unstoppable force. Every master had faced the consequences of their cruelty, and the city itself had witnessed, in silence, the power of intelligence, patience, and courage. And so, the night ended. But the legacy of Solomon's actions was only beginning. The darkness that had been his ally, the shadows that had concealed him, the careful planning and execution of his plan, these were the elements that had created a new reality. Charleston, a city built on oppression and cruelty, had been forever altered by the actions of one man who refused to be broken, one mind that had transformed rage into precision, one soul that had taken justice into its own hands. Solomon's reckoning was complete, and yet it would echo through the streets, the mansions, and the hearts of all who lived there for years to come. The night had passed, leaving Charleston under the first gentle light of dawn, but the echoes of what had occurred lingered like a secret the city itself could not yet articulate. Streets were quiet, the air thick with anticipation, though most citizens had no knowledge of the events that had reshaped the balance of power in their midst. The masters who had once ruled with cruelty and arrogance were gone, buried by the precision of Solomon's hand, their absence leaving both a void and a silent terror among the remaining households. And yet, Solomon himself was nowhere to be seen. He had vanished into the early morning mist, moving as he always had, silent, unseen, a shadow in a city that had underestimated him. Solomon's mind was not at ease, despite the success of his plan. The weight of what he had done pressed upon him like a physical force, heavy and inescapable. He understood that vengeance, even when precise and calculated, carried a cost. The lives he had taken were not taken in rage but in deliberate justice, yet every soul lost bore witness to the intensity of his purpose. As he moved through the alleys and hidden paths of Charleston, his thoughts were not of triumph but of reflection. Each step reminded him of the years of suffering, the nights of observation, the careful calculations, and the patience required to transform anger into action. He walked past the quiet shacks of the enslaved, whose lives had been touched, directly and indirectly, by his actions. Some whispered of the night in fearful tones, speaking of shadows moving among the mansions, of screams that dissolved into silence, of the sudden and inexplicable disappearances of the masters who had once ruled with brutality. These whispers carried both fear and awe, a mix of reverence and terror for the man who had dared to turn the city's power structures upside down. Though few knew his identity, the legend of the shadow who had exacted justice grew with each retelling. Solomon moved unseen through this world he had changed, understanding that the stories carried a power all their own. He found a quiet spot overlooking the harbor, the water shimmering under the rising sun, reflecting the orange and pink hues of dawn. The tides moved steadily, oblivious to the upheaval that had occurred on land. As he gazed at the water, he considered the meaning of his actions. They were not acts of vengeance born from uncontrolled rage, but deliberate, measured responses to years of cruelty. Each master had been given the consequences of their own behavior, their arrogance and oppression mirrored back to them in the most unforgiving way. The city would remember, even if no one knew exactly why, that the world had shifted, that power could be questioned, and that even the most oppressed could wield agency when driven by intelligence, patience, and purpose. Solomon understood that his work had not ended with the execution of his plan. The city, the enslaved, and even the few who had survived the terror of that night were now living with the consequences. Fear had replaced arrogance among those who had believed themselves untouchable. Whispers of shadows, of a cunning avenger, of justice delivered without mercy spread quietly, seeding unease in the minds of those who had once ruled unchecked. Solomon's presence was both absent and omnipresent, a paradox that added to the legend. The city was forever changed, yet to the casual observer it seemed as though nothing had occurred. This invisibility was deliberate. His legacy did not require recognition, only impact. He thought of the other enslaved people who had shared the quarters, who had glimpsed his resolve in subtle ways, but never fully understood the extent of his planning. Some would live in fear of discovery, others would whisper stories in secret, and all would carry with them the knowledge that one of their own had risen from oppression to orchestrate something unimaginable. Solomon considered the responsibility he now bore, the knowledge that his actions had consequences beyond the immediate. He was both liberator and shadow, his actions reverberating through the lives of countless others, shaping a new reality that was fragile and full of tension. The months and years that followed were a study in the persistence of legacy. Solomon did not return to the mansions, did not flaunt his deeds, and did not seek recognition. He moved quietly, blending with the world, yet every day he observed the subtle shifts in Charleston. The city's elite grew cautious, their arrogance tempered by the invisible hand of justice. The enslaved grew bolder, whispering stories of the shadow who had defied the masters, stories that carried both hope and fear, teaching them the power of intelligence and patience over brute force. Solomon's influence, though unseen, was everywhere. In quiet moments, Solomon reflected on the paradox of vengeance and justice. He had acted to correct wrongs, to balance the scales of suffering, yet he understood that his actions were not simple. They were morally complex, a blend of necessity and consequence. He considered the lives lost, the terror instilled, the fear that would echo for years. And yet, he recognized that inaction had been impossible, that patience and intelligence were tools to channel a fire that had long demanded release. Every choice, every decision, had been weighed carefully, and the outcome, though terrifying, was deliberate and controlled. The city itself seemed to respond to his presence, or perhaps to the absence left by the master's removal. Charleston's streets, its houses, and even its air carried a quiet tension, a sense that something extraordinary had occurred. Solomon watched as daily life resumed, but always with subtle differences. Guards moved with extra caution, the remaining masters hesitated before issuing commands, and the enslaved navigated their world with a newfound awareness of the possibility of resistance. The ripple effects of his actions extended far beyond what anyone could see, a subtle reshaping of society driven by intellect and courage rather than chaos and rage. Solomon also grappled with the personal weight of being legend and ghost simultaneously. To those who whispered his name, he was a force of awe and fear. To those who walked past him in the streets, he was invisible. This duality was deliberate, necessary for both survival and impact. He understood that visibility was a risk, that recognition could undo everything he had accomplished. The true power of his actions lay not in fame, but in consequence, in the knowledge that intelligence and strategy could overturn centuries of oppression. Even in solitude, Solomon did not find peace in the conventional sense. There were moments when memories of cruelty returned, when the faces of the masters he had buried haunted him, and when the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his chest. Yet, these moments were tempered by purpose. He understood that the path he had chosen required both action and reflection, that vengeance was not a release but a responsibility, and that the legacy he carried was as much about guiding others as it was about personal justice. Time passed, and Charleston continued to whisper the legend of the shadow. New generations of enslaved learned of him in secret, understanding the power of intellect, patience, and courage. The story became more than a tale of fear. It became a lesson, a symbol of resistance, and a guide for those who would navigate oppression with strategy rather than brute force. Solomon's influence persisted, intangible yet undeniable, shaping the culture of survival and defiance in ways that were both subtle and profound. In the quiet corners of the city, Solomon observed the evolution of his legacy. The mansions that had once represented absolute power now stood as monuments to the consequences of arrogance. The enslaved who had survived the terror and watched the invisible hand of justice unfold carried a mixture of fear and reverence, understanding that intelligence and patience were weapons as potent as any physical force. Solomon's shadow had become a teacher, a reminder, a silent force that reshaped the world around him without ever being seen directly. He understood that legacy was not about recognition nor about glory. It was about impact, about the invisible threads that connected action to consequence, intelligence to survival, patience to change. Solomon's work had shifted the balance of power, created a cautionary tale, and demonstrated that those deemed powerless could, through careful observation and strategy, challenge the foundations of oppression. His story was not one of vengeance alone, but of resilience, calculation, and the transformation of suffering into purpose. In solitude, Solomon allowed himself to imagine the long-term effects of his actions. He envisioned a city where fear tempered arrogance, where strategy guided resistance, where the oppressed understood that intelligence and patience could be as formidable as brute strength. He imagined whispers of his name passing from one generation to the next, stories that would inspire caution, resilience, and ingenuity. The shadow he had become was no longer just a presence of terror. It was a symbol, a living lesson embedded in the culture and consciousness of Charleston. Solomon walked through the quiet streets, observing the subtle changes his actions had wrought. The city's rhythm had shifted. The air carried a tension that had not existed before, a reminder that power was not absolute, that cruelty could be answered, and that intelligence and patience were formidable weapons. The enslaved moved with an awareness that inspired quiet confidence, while the remaining masters navigated their lives with new caution, understanding that invisibility did not imply impotence. Solomon's presence, though unseen, had become a force of transformation, subtly reshaping the behaviors, expectations, and fears of all who lived there. Even as decades passed, the memory of that night lingered, whispered among those who had survived and shared secretly with those who came after. Solomon's legacy was a mixture of fear, respect, and inspiration, a story that endured precisely because it was incomplete, mysterious, and legendary. To those who had, why? To nest even a fraction of his cunning, he was a mythic figure, a shadow that had walked among them, executed justice, and vanished without recognition. He had become eternal in the memory of the city, a testament to the power of strategy, patience, and intelligence over brute force. Solomon's life continued in quiet anonymity, yet every choice he made was informed by the lessons of that night, the knowledge of consequence, and the responsibility of legacy. He had become a living example of how the oppressed could, through careful observation, patience, and courage, reshape the world around them. His story was no longer just about vengeance, it was about transformation, about the ability to turn suffering into power, fear into strategy, and injustice into a lesson that would endure far beyond his lifetime. And so Solomon's shadow stretched beyond the physical, beyond the streets of Charleston, into the hearts and minds of those who learned of him in whispers. His legacy was not measured by recognition, wealth, or status, but by the invisible threads of influence that reshaped a city, taught the value of intelligence over brute force, and demonstrated that even the most oppressed could exact change when guided by courage, patience, and strategy. Charleston would never forget, even if its people never fully understood, that one man, born into chains, had walked among the powerful and altered the course of history in silence.